started out with the time period of the Russian Revolution and talked about the influence of the great revolutionary Marxist leader, of course, Lenin, who created the Bolshevik Party and made a tremendous revolution, and had quite an influence around the world on the labor movement and the class struggle. And then following that, he did a class on the period just after that, 1919 to 1926, which was the impact of the World War I and the continuing impact of the Bolshevik Revolution on the U.S. labor movement. We have those in video form, and we're actually going to be transcribing it into a book. This one is, as you probably saw, 1929 to 1938, which is just a heroic period in the U.S. labor movement, the rise of the industrial unions and the birth of the CIO. So Milt, some of you may not know Milt, he has for many decades provided really important leadership to the party regarding our labor work. Was a long-time steel worker in the Buffalo area and is currently a contributing editor to Workers' World newspaper. So just before we go, I think maybe it'd be helpful, since some of us don't know each other, to go around the room and introduce ourselves. So, but I also wanted to do a plug for what's going to be like 14-hour class, basically. Our National Fight Back Conference, which is in just 2 weeks. It's both Saturday and Sunday. And it'll be tremendous experience as well as a participatory experience as far as discussing many critical points regarding strengthen the struggle and fight back against reaction and the U.S. government. And if you can help with getting the word out about this, there's many brochures on this, and there's also an important youth meeting, organizing meeting during that conference at 6 o'clock, and there's flyers about that we'd love to get more out on. So why don't we just do a quick around the room. I'm Sharon Ailing. I coordinate the education work and classes for Workers' World with others, and if you have any ideas or suggestions, we'll pass around kind of an evaluation survey after the class, and you can write them down, or you can talk to me or somebody else in the party about how you would, what suggestions you have for other topics or how to improve the class. So let's see. Monica. So I'll turn it over to Milt.
Thank you, Sharon, for that introduction and the rest of the important work of the party. The topic I selected, there's probably volumes of material that have been written about this period precisely because it's a very tumultuous time in the labor movement. And there's all different approaches to it. But if it's one thing that I would like to get across right at the very beginning, is that this period reflected, one, that every profound change in social, economic, and political history, every social change takes place from below. It comes from the masses of people hungry for change for one reason or another, intervene in the history and bring about change. It doesn't come from any other source, although many forces join for different reasons, which we may have time to go into. The second point that I feel that a communist organization must present in this period is the tremendous power that labor has, organized and unorganized labor, when they decide to withhold their labor or they decide for some course of action, it's felt in the highest circles of the ruling class. And the third point that I feel we should keep in mind is the tremendous sacrifices and the heroism of workers and oppressed people when they're on the move. They climb the mountains that never were climbed before, in spite of the most difficult conditions. They find a way to enter into the arena of class struggle. Now, with that opening, I was hoping that perhaps that could be passed around. It's a page that I want to refer to from Lenin's left-wing communism and infantile disorder, even though this is a decade later. It's very much alive. Now, what were the three most significant issues that the trade unions faced during that period? One, how to organize industrial unions. This was a critical question for the trade union movement. And for 50 years, ever since the industrial workers of the world, along with some early communists and socialists, such as Eugene Debs and others, Bill Haywood, Forster and Cannon, who turned out one to be a leader in the Communist Party and the other the Socialist Workers' Party, tried to introduce industrial unions as far back as the beginning of the 20th century. And it was fought tooth and nail by corporations, the state, and the newly formed American Federation of Labor, who built their entire organization on the basis of craft unionism. So that was a very important issue during this period that we'll discuss. The second most important issue was the independent role of the trade unions. How to be able to be combative without conciliatory to even different wings of the ruling class or the government or the bosses. So that the independent struggle that we have discussed and participated in the Million Worker March that began was very much on the minds of the leaders during this period. And the third point of this discussion of this period was how to bind a communist party, a revolutionary party, to the trade unions, to develop relationships that would be involved, helpful, supportive, creative for strategy and tactics, and elevate the class consciousness of workers in the trade unions who have many different levels of consciousness. And those 3 points, as a party of ours, how to continue the heritage and bring that back into the 21st century over 50 years of the day, 30, 50, 70 years, when this period we're discussing. Now, let's view a little bit what was going on at that time in order to see how this plays out. And I have here a quote that was what we call the golden age of capitalism, which was the 20s. They never had it so good in the 20s up until 1929 when the crash came about. So if you just bear with me, I want to just give you an indication of what was going on before the crash. Yeah. Let me just read something to you. In 1929, for example, J.P. Morgan and his 17 partners alone had 99 directorships in 72 of the largest corporations in the country with combined assets. And at that time, if you had $20 billion, it would be equal today to trillions of dollars. When the directorships of the Morgan allies were added, Morgan's interests controlled the assets of approximately $74 billion, sufficient to give them an adequate voice, and this is saying it mildly, in the country's policies. There were 300,000, let me skip that and say there were 200 giants. Less than 1/7% of the wealth of this country controlled almost 50% of the corporate wealth of the country. And the controllers of the country were really approximately 200 giants that were spread out between J.P. Morgan, Rockefeller, and a family named Mellon. So what was happening during the 20s was a tremendous accumulation of wealth and power that was able to impose its will. And the will that they were imposing right after the First World War, is starting in 1920, and it's worth repeating, is that on one hand, the results of the war, the First World War, the U.S. was able, without having suffered any territorial attacks, was able to be the supply of commodities and goods and capital throughout Europe that needed it desperately because of what the outcome of the First World War was, so that wealth was accumulated at a tremendous rate, and the powers that accumulated it were some of the families I mentioned. Now, at the same time, you would think that with that much of wealth and the ability to invest their capital and so on, that they would have a trickle-down theory that would give the workers and the oppressed a piece of the action. But they didn't. They didn't. In 1920, they introduced an attorney general that's similar to John Ashcroft. His name was Palmer. And I just want to read if you just be patient. I'm not good at this stuff. I usually don't use this format, but this well, if I find it, I may recall it, but let me say what it is. On one day alone, the FBI and the Department of Justice raided thousands of offices of left-wing, communist, socialist, workers, trade unionists, jailed them. The impact of the Palmer raids on the trade union movement and the labor movement and the left wing and the socialist and communist movement was decimating. As a matter of fact, it was the beginning of the birth of a communist party. And as soon as it was born, it had to go underground. And even then, it had to split in two parts under the tremendous repression. So you had a combination here of wealth and oppression. That was what was called the golden age of the 20s, and you may have seen movies on it, and culture and the dancing and all the and the bourgeoisie was in its glory as it danced its way and had all the fetishes that go with it. I remember when I was a kid, had somebody on, Kelly was on a pole for 100 days or something like that, and everybody praised Lindbergh, who made a trip by himself across, who turned out to be a fascist. But anyway, he was praised to the hilt in those days, and everybody used to be, where's Lindbergh? And yeah. So we grew up in this kind of atmosphere, and the deception was incredible. You never knew about all this repression when you were, you know, teenagers. Now, I just want to indicate that as a result of this wealth, a major general decided sometimes among the military they split, and some of them get a guilty conscience if they are inclined that way. I'd like to read what a Major General Smedley Butler, who was a U.S. Marine commandant, told what his job was, what his role was. He says, I spent 33 years and 4 months in the active service as a member of our country's most agile military force, the Marine Corps. I'll skip a little list. And during the period, I spent most of my time being a high-class muscle man for big business, for Wall Street, and for the bankers. In short, I was a racketeer for capitalism. Now, this is a major general. Thus, I helped make Mexico, and especially Tampico, safe for the American oil interests in 1914. I helped make Haiti and Cuba a decent place for the National City Bank to collect revenues. I helped purify Nicaragua for the International Banking House of Brown Brothers in 1909 and 1912. I brought light to the Dominican Republic for American sugar interests. I helped make Honduras right for the American fruit companies. And in 1903, in China, in 1927, I helped to see that Standard Oil went its way unmolested. See, so you get a kind of a feel of what the repression was here at home and the exploitation. In a post-war period, it was supposed to be a peace period. And this is what the military was doing. Oh, page 241 of LABOR'S Untold Story. Thank you. Now,
you can find it on the internet. Search for Butler.
Huh? Okay. Now, what did this do? See, this is why I decided to print this page, because Lenin, see, well, no, it's not this page. I'm sorry. In imperialism and the highest stage of capitalism, which I hope at some point we'll be able to examine, Lenin said that the tremendous concentration of production and capital created a new stage of capitalism. He called it imperialism. And he went on to say that there was a merger for the first time of corporate wealth with banking wealth. They merged together. And he made the term called finance capital. His description of this stage of capitalism to monopoly capitalism, he went on to say that it also included the ability of the U.S. to export their capital all over the world so that those like Smedley, Butler, and O could protect it. the capital. And then he also included the fact that territories were divided among these parasite capitalist countries, a division of labor, a division of turf, I should say, not labor. And then he finally ended on the basis that every so often there needs to be a redivision of the spoils, and then you have an imperialist war. So that here we see the nature of the beast. See, in regard to what was going on in the 20s that we now see reaching its fruition in the 21st century. Now, the 1929, they went along, and then all of a sudden, there was a crash. It was called the 1929 capitalist crash, and it was a crisis of capitalism. And if I can just find a page, which I hope is right here, 240, because reading some of this is better than explaining it. 249, I'm looking at 240, well, okay. All right. In Labor's Untold Story, the authors go on to describe the vast economy of the nation, its mills, factory, mines, its stores, transport, and distribution came to a slow grinding stop, or at the best proceeded at about half speed. Some 5,761 banks failed. Gross farm income dropped to little less than 5 billion. Wage cuts, one after the other, until they averaged less than 45% of what they were prior. Industrial production dropped by almost 50%. By 1933, there were anywhere from 12 million to 17 million unemployed. Now, the interesting thing about this attack, this crisis, is they go on to, the author goes on to explain, and it's page 249. There was food, millions of tons of it, but people were starving, as the food was destroyed or left to rot because it couldn't be sold at a profit. There was clothing warehouses filled with it, and millions were shivering for lack of it as the Depression continued until about 1933. Thousands were evicted from their homes, had to suffer the cold rain, wind, and snow in the leaky tar paper shacks that were called Hoovervilles, that were built all around the country. Shacks and tents, cardboard homes. Bread lines. Veterans sold apples on the stands who had just come back from the wars. So you get a feeling of the class as it was in the crash of 1929. And this went on to about 1933. 3 to 4 years of this attack. So you would think that how can workers awaken to anything? How can you emerge if, you know, as communists that look over the mass movement as we are, we say, well, where is the light? Where is the opportunity to open up a struggle? Well, they did. In 1930, right after the crash, hundreds of thousands came out into the streets in the name of unemployment councils on March 4th, 1930. It was an incredible, in every urban city, New York, Detroit, Chicago, all of them, all those urban cities, councils were formed And in those days, the Communist Party organized those marches and rallies and demonstrations. But there was also other councils that began to be formed that merged together. There was the Socialist Unemployment Council, and then there was, in our history, which is another class perhaps, an unemployment league developed that we came out of in a merger that took place in the 30s. It was called the American Workers' Party, and it combined Musty, A.J. Musty, which I may go into if we have time, and what turned out to be our own party at that time. Now, also what was happening at that time was the technological revolution. Just as we're involved in the technological revolution now, of computerization, cybernation, and robotization, and so on. The development of technology in those days was also a great quantum leap that affected the workers very much. It was called, in some ways, the Ford assembly line. And you might have seen in the old days Charlie Chaplin, who used to kind of make it into a comedy, but it really wasn't. The workers, the piecework, at that time they were paid by the amount of pieces that they would be able to produce with a very low base wage. So much so that the incentives could be changed by these big corporations like Ford and General Motors. And working in the heat of an assembly line during the summer months created tremendous stress and pressure, injuries, and even deaths. So that the development of this kind of conditions in the workforce began with the unemployed beginning to waken up to all this oppression. The workers in the plants and the industries were also beginning to get mad and angry. So that by 1934, everything hit like a thunderstorm, like a hurricane of strikes and struggles. And there were three that took place in 1934 that changed the whole face of the labor movement due to the workers' struggles. One of them is those of us who worked with the Million Worker March and got to know Local 10 of the ILW. The ILW it was called the ILA in those days. In 1934, they decided to call a strike. And in San Francisco, yes, in San Francisco. And what it was all about was that this was an open, what we call open labor town, meaning unions were not welcome. And they had what they called the Blue Book Union. The Blue Book Union meant if you wanted a job, you had to go to the companies who hired absolute thugs, gangsters, see, to give, if you wanted a job, and what we call in those days a shape-up, that you would come out, and if you had the blue book that was given, and the hiring halls could be in a casino, it could be in wherever they felt it was convenient. And if you had the blue book and you were favorites, they would point, you, and you, the rest of you can go home. And when I worked in the steel plants, we had that same relationship with some of the older workers. The same thing was happening in steel. When the morning shape-ups would take place, if you didn't get the job during this period, and you'd have a lunch bucket, you'd take the lunch bucket and go home with it because you didn't want to. You wanted to have the food for the next day because you'd be coming out hoping you'd get a job, and you'd put it in the icebox, no refrigerators, and then the next day you'd come out and you'd sort of, can I, raise your hand, hope that you would be selected. Well, that's what was going on in San Francisco. And in addition to that, the work, in those days, there wasn't that technology that they have today with cranes. You went into these holes in the ships. I'm sorry? He knows he's a retired Marine organizer, union organizer. So you go into these holes and you would have to hook up, maybe you had little room to hook up under a rope or claw from a crane, see? And you may have only a foot to maneuver, and if the crane was off, you could be killed, you could be injured. And you weren't paid. There was different levels of pay. In a sense, the majority would get hardly 40 cents or 30 cents an hour, and the more favorites would get a little more. So that began to burn in among the workers, and they began to decide, we can't go on with this. So they decided they would call a strike. Well, as soon as you call a strike, everybody comes down on you. Your own leaders don't say, well, I'm not sure this is a good time. The AFL was out there in those days, the craft unions. The government comes down on you that and Roosevelt was president, so he said, we'll send somebody out to discuss it with you. And that kind of created illusions. So they had to go through all kinds of delays and times. But then someone who came into the industry named Harry Bridges, who to this day, there's a discussion of whether he was in the Communist Party or not. But you got to know that when you were at the Million Worker March, or you go to talk to any of the local 10 leaders, the first thing they'll say, Harry Bridges, Harry Bridges. And it was true. See, what Harry Bridges did, under the most difficult circumstances, he organized a workers' central committee of strikers to make the decisions. It was a rank and file decision. It wouldn't have anybody in leadership in the AFL. It was only made up among the workers who became the command to make the decisions. And they decided on a course of action. And what was it? Well, the first thing they had to do was get solidarity. They couldn't do it by themselves. So they went to the maritime unions at that time. The sailors coming in with all the commodities, which had a million grievances of their own aboard the ships, supported the strike. Then Bridges went to the Teamsters, who, when the ships are unloaded by the longshore, then the trucks come and pick them up and bring them to the warehouses. So they asked the Teamsters to support the strike, and they did. So what happened was these three powerful unions, numerically, not that they had that much influence, paralyzed the city. So that in the months, it was about an 8-month struggle, they actually shut down the city of San Francisco, shut it down. And of course the ruling class couldn't accept that. So what? They organized National Guard, they deputized their own thugs, they brought in the police, and there was a standoff. And on Thursday, it's called Bloody Thursday, the standoff took place in front of a street. What's the name of it? Embarcadero? Embarcadero. It's a street leading into the docks. Who controlled that street? controlled the movement of goods and services coming aboard. So it was a bloody Thursday. 2 workers got killed, many were injured. They did their toll on some of the thugs and the sheriff and the deputies and the National Guard. And then after that, it appeared that the leaders of the AFL said enough is enough, and they pushed bridges aside, and they began to open up the city for what they said were the necessities of life, which the workers opened up for certain necessities. And little by little, the general strike got lost. See, it was a general strike that didn't involve the country. It involved a city and the industry, the maritime industries and the Teamsters that were in the northern part of California, spreading to Seattle, Tacoma, and some other areas. But it was called a general strike, but it was really a strike for one major purpose, to win some economic demands, but at the same time, by bringing these unions together, it created what we call an industrial union. So the ILA from a craft became an industrial union. Now, there were 2 other strikes. If I'd like to go into them, but I'm not sure at the time. One was called the Toledo Auto Strike, and that was in 1934. All these strikes took place in the same year. The Toledo Auto Strike, which is part of our heritage, actually was a dress rehearsal for the big GM struggles that took place in 1937, 3 years later. What was significant about the Toledo Auto Strike was they began for the first time to take on these giant auto companies. They've never been touched before. These corporations, even though the AFL had organized unions, in the auto industry only had company unions at best. Even when Roosevelt passed what was considered the NIRA, the National Recovery Act, where he put in a section that said unions had the right to organize, the companies ignored it completely and said, if you're going to organize a union, we'll give you a union, we'll give you a company union. And that's what was happening in the auto industries and the steel unions, and all the industrial industries at that time, but led by the power General Motors, that was Morgan, and Rockefeller interests. So the Toledo Auto Strike did something very unique. They went on strike, but the company got an injunction against them, which is what happens in strikes, and the union was about ready to give in, but a few rank and file workers went down to the unemployment councils, which was centered in Toledo, that I described a little earlier. And they met this individual, Musty, who we knew as part of our own heritage, but not the same. We're revolutionaries. He was a preacher who turned toward the labor movement, but a tremendously courageous man. And he said, okay, you got an injunction, we'll be out there tomorrow and we'll stop all the non-workers scabs from going in. And they got, in one day, they got over 1,000 members from the unemployed council to set their picket lines around that Toledo auto light, which made a lot of important products for the big assembly lines of General Motors in Detroit. And that stopped them cold. And it was a shock to General Motors. So once again, just like in San Francisco, they organized thugs, they organized the National Guard, they organized the police department, and also a bloody battles took place. Important thing that comes out of these 2 strikes that I mentioned, and now I'll go into the third, which is the Minneapolis strike that took place with a group of Teamsters in Minneapolis in the same year. Mind you, this is all 1934. Can you imagine one year where 3 general strikes break out? In Minneapolis, and they were part of our heritage, our party to a large extent came out of the Minneapolis strikes. They had a unique approach too. See, now what was their unique approach? Well, they were truck drivers, what we call in-city. They delivered coal and ice, see, in the inner cities. And they decided they couldn't take any more based upon all the conditions I described economically and the speed-ups and the pressure. It was called the open city. Minneapolis and St. were called the open city, non-union completely. They had what they called their citizens committee. They were organized in Minneapolis. So the strike began, and it was led by a group of Trotskyites. They were the leadership of it, and we can talk about Trotskyites at a different time. But what they decided to do, first they took over a tremendous garage that had all kinds of needs, and it was their central headquarters. And being drivers, they decided to have a dispatching setup similar to where calls would come in from different parts of the city that would say, we need help over here. So a bunch of drivers who were waiting to hear where they should go, they jump in their cars, zoom out to this area, set up the solid picket lines, drive out the scabs from carrying their goods into the inner cities. So they developed a whole, what we call flying squadrons, see, that were on the move, see, wherever was necessary to be dispatched. And that began to worry these so-called big business citizens alliances. Then they did something else. They decided, as drivers, they should go to the warehouse workers who actually get the goods and services, and then they're trucked, they keep them in the warehouses and then truck them out. And they won them over. So there was solidarity between the Teamster drivers and the warehouse workers, and it shut the city of Minneapolis down. So then another battle developed, and just similar to the other two I described, but it was at like a farmer's market, like you see here downtown. The question was, would the city be able to break through that picket line that was surrounding the farmer's market so they can get their trucks in, get the produce in, get the produce out, and break the strike? Well, they had their bloody Thursday with the goons, the government, National Guard, and so on. So what happened was, it was the rise of industrial unions that came out of this. The craft unions that had existed, where if you had a skill, you were in one union. If you had another skill, you were in another local. Now all of a sudden it broke down, and you were getting not only solidarity, but you were getting all these workers unskilled that were beginning to emerge as leaders and fighters that took over the union movement, that began their unions. Also, and I want to refer, when you read Lenin called, in this page we passed around, Lenin talks about the importance of strikes and struggles as schools of communism. Not the revolution itself, but they're schools. They teach workers who their friends are, who their enemies are. They teach them about the role of the state. And certainly in these three strikes I just mentioned, the state, the government, the corporations, the workers learned that the government was not their friend. See, that the state was a repressive institution made up of cops, jails that they had to do time in. The lessons were incredible. So that, and by the way, the Teamsters Minneapolis strike was also a general strike in the sense that they shut down the entire city of Minneapolis. So those three strikes began to elevate the mood and the anger and the development, and lo and behold, a year later, a group of leaders got together who were not involved in this. There was although John L. Lewis, there is a group, and what did they do? They formed a committee, and they called themselves the Committee for Industrial Unions, called the CIO. But it was a committee. It was a first step as a result of this tremendous strikes and struggles that the idea came for all unions that are not part of the craft unions of the AFL should come together. And they had their first meeting in 1935, and this statement I have from the mine workers, who I keep in touch with, sent me this, of how the committee of the industrial unions were formed. The Congress, first it was a committee. See, then it became a Congress in 1938. The reason that it was able to develop into a broad Congress of labor, of industrial unions, was because of the powerful sit-downs that developed in 1937, a year earlier, in General Motors. And you can read the sit-downs, but it was incredible. They took over hundreds of General Motors plants, sat in for 8 months, 8 months or somewhere around that. I have it on, I'm not using these things anymore. It takes me too long to find them. But they were in, can you imagine living in a plant for 8 months? Now, you had to be organized. And they did get organized. You know, they had committees that disciplined their own members. You know, you have to take care. You didn't want to destroy the equipment, because if you did, they'd come in like gangbusters and tear you up. So don't touch the equipment. They had shifts at the different doors. You had to serve your shift just like you were in a military situation. In some cases, the women would bring the food in through stores doors that the company didn't know which doors they were coming into. So they were being fed, but they weren't with their families for all this time. They were told, you have to keep yourself clean. You have to shower more. Use the companies, you know, they have their shower rooms. The bosses did, so they lived with, you know, like the way the bosses do when they leave their jobs. They had to find ways to bring in new clothes. It was like an army that was functioning, and to maintain it for so long, until such time that General Motors felt then nothing's going to happen. They're not coming out, and we're not producing one automobile. So then the same things happened, what happened to the other three strikes. So with all that development, the Congress of Industrial Unions came about, and with the rise of the CIO, there was a whole new atmosphere that developed until the threat of a Second World War. Once again, the U.S. went through a depression, then they were able to recoup, and then finally They saw the Second World War developing, and they began to repeat what they won from the First World War. We'll provide all the money, the capital, the goods, and let the Europeans fight the war against Hitler for a while. Franklin D. Roosevelt claimed neutrality like Woodrow Wilson did in 1916. But meanwhile, they were getting prepared militarily to make an intervention. Now, I'd like to sum up what I earlier said about the three issues that were so important to the labor movement, the trade union movement of those days. One, how to build industrial unions. That was a fact of life now. It would never change. Industrial unions would exist even to this day, notwithstanding leaders who are not carrying out the will of the members in many cases. The independence of the trade unions to find a way to express your needs economically and politically without the imposition of the government, the parties, particularly the Democratic as well as the Republican Party. And they did that as best they could to try to keep independently of the machinery of the government. But that didn't stop the government from coming in and applying their pressure on the strikes that I described earlier. Now, the third point that I mentioned was the binding of the Revolutionary Party with the trade union struggle. This, unfortunately, was not accomplished. The parties that existed during the 30s, first, the Communist Party went through a shift because what happened in the Soviet Union, that Sharon described as everybody looking to the Soviet Union and Lenin and the leaders of the revolution. Lenin died in 1924. And the struggle developed in the Soviet Union. And a left opposition was crushed. And Stalin, who could be defined as a centrist, took over to carry out the will and the direction of the socialist country. And in 1929, 28 or 29, the revolution was in danger from counter-revolution internally, not externally only. There were the kulaks, there was those who still believed in bourgeois forms of economy and politics, and there was also those who were interested in returning the system to privatization, particularly on the land that had been socialized. So Stalin made a turn to the left to defend the socialist gains of the 1917 revolution. And he called on all those who were loyal to his grouping to go left with him. And in the United States, it was interpreted in a unique kind of way. They moved toward what we call dual unionism. Not independent unions, but dual unions to combat the AFL. And they carried out with workers some heroic strikes, but they were destroyed. And it weakened the party and the labor movement, because the AFL was glad to get rid of them when they decided to leave and start what were called red unions or pure unions. And Lenin, in this page I passed around, he describes it, that you shouldn't do that, but he was dead by that time. He wrote this in 1920. So that the dual unionism weakened the main party of those days, the Communist Party. The Socialist Workers' Party had just come into existence starting in 1928-29, and they were just trying to unite with other forces that I described earlier, A.J. Musty in Toledo and some others, and form another party. They weren't even a party in the real sense of the word yet. So they couldn't intervene in these struggles, except in Minneapolis and to some extent in Toledo, because Musty, who the party united with, was in the leadership. So the parties couldn't intervene as Lenin conceived to advance it, as you read your page, couldn't advance it from industrial unionism to a higher level of what we call dual power. That is, having general strikes turn into political struggles as well as economic struggles, and make demands that would elevate the workers politically as well as economically. And once that couldn't happen, the momentum began to change with the beginning of the Second World, as the Second World War approached, and opportunist leaders began to take over the trade union movement and push out those who carried on these heroic struggles. And the AFL got stronger as a result of it. So the AFL began to exert more pressure. Not that they were craft unions anymore. They were forced to take on industrial unionism, but they had the same conservative outlook. Work with the employers, collaborate with the government, whoever they were in power, to see if you can get some of the crumbs to come down the pike so that the workers would get some measure of justice. This began to become, and more the rule than the exception, although there were exceptions in the years later on. But as I said in an earlier talk, there was never an election in the AFL. They had to die before they were replaced, until the last 1995, when Sweeney ran against Kirkland. Against who? Donahue, yeah. Donahue was Kirkland's man. So let me end up on the fact that we should return to examine Lenin, not only on this, to go over left-wing communism and infantile disorder, this is only one page of, and to see how Lenin understood the nature of the current crisis in terms of monopoly capitalism and what has developed in terms of the concentration of wealth that has far surpassed his own conception that exists today. And finally, we should all be looking forward to further working with Local 10 of the ILWU and remind them of what they reminded us of the days of the San Francisco General Strike, and our appreciation of what they did with the Million Worker March, and hope to move it forward for more independent, class-wide politics that elevates the struggle to another level as we move into the post-election period. That's it.
Terminology. If you have any things that you, not quite sure you understood, but also contributions of those who, know a little bit about this period, or not just this period, how it relates to the struggle today. So I'm just going to open it up and just take a look at who's got their hands up. Let me... Okay. Valerie.
I just want to thank you, Milt. Really new to politics and working in D.C. at the work session with the organizers from Local 10 was such a thrill to meet them in person. And now what you've said, it makes it even more important. And, it's really wonderful.
Henry?
I'd like to pick up where Milt mentioned Harry Bridges, and he was pushed aside by the AFL, and he was charged by the AFL of being a communist. The government got involved in it and brought him up on charges. They were trying to deport him, but they had no reason to deport him, other than the fact he lied on his application for citizenship. So they had a trial. Make a long story short, they had 7 trials trying to find a reason to deport him. On the 7th trial, the government, as he demanded, his team of lawyers demanded, an apology. No money. Just an apology. And at that particular time, after seeing that, the union had paid for all of his trial. At the same time, British never took a complete salary. He took what he needed and left the rest for the union. In the meantime, the companies were trying to buy him off. They have sent blank checks to him. You go to Local 10 now, it's on the wall. Still up there. You never cashed or took any of them. Just you writing the number. So they never got it. And he eventually put him in a glass covering there. Various steamship companies, most of them are not in existence at the present time. Further on Bloody Thursday, it is still celebrated. Every year, the maritime unions and the longshoremen get together and walk and march along in Embarcadero Street and sort of bringing back the memory of the Bloody Tuesday. At about that same time, the National Maritime Union was founded by the Communist Party. They picked a word is boatswain. Boatswain on the ship is the lead seaman in the deck department. They're usually a big, tough guy. In those days, you had to fight your way up. So they picked a fellow by the name of Joseph Curran, who was not a member of the party. But with him, they put 2 other people with him, Blackie Myers or Frederick Myers and Smith, Ferdinand Smith. And wherever Curran went, those 2 was there. Curran was asked a question, either Myers or Smith would answer it. They were like 2 bookends. So that went on. They gave him so-called card membership. He had it for about a year. They withdrew it. And they continued on at the same pace until years later. That's about it over. I mean, you mentioned a hole I brought up. When you say a hole, there are many holes. But in this case, it was a cargo hold. But the cargo is stored. There's no cranes on the ships then. They're called booms. Steel sticks that sticks out this way. You can adjust them with whatever you want to get the cargo off the ship or on the ship. And they're called booms. A couple other things, but I don't think I want to go into it. The educational system that on the picket lines, it usually came from someone that the union or the organization would pick that knows something about the history of labor or the need for a labor union. It was called the picket captain. He did two things. He, at least the ones I'm familiar with, he would hold on the picket line, education and fashion. He would get in the center while you picketed around, and he would talk about various things in there. That's where the education really came from. And he kept count. The assistant captain there, he more or less kept record who was there, who served how much time. A strike committee would designate the number of hours you would get to get a strike clearance. Speaking about the Maritime Union, if you did not serve your time on a picket line, you would say 4 hours a day or 2 hours, whatever, you could not get cleared to go to your ship unless there was nobody else. Then you got cleared. So your job was prevented.
All right, thank you. Okay, Sue.
Couple of things. One, I mean, I'm sure everybody's, I'm sure everybody is aware of the current policies of the AFL-CIO, where they are pouring millions into the Kerry campaign. And they just, how much?
65 days.
65 million. I mean, I find it so outrageous, and I just have to point that out, that some things have not changed in terms of trying to think that they can influence capitalism. The second thing is, there's a wonderful movie that I saw a number of years ago. I think the name of it is Babies and Banners. It's about the role of the women's brigades in helping the success. They were integral to the success of the Flint sit-down strike. And if people have not seen, I see Joe is going to put this down for the People's Video Network. It's great. It's a fabulous movie. And if people haven't seen it, I highly recommend it. Because it not only does it show the critical role that the women play, but you get a lot of labor history and significance of the struggles from it. In doing on the picket line and covering Bush's changes to the overtime law, I've become aware of the fact that there was some very important labor legislation passed in 1934 and 35 that actually allowed unions to gave them legitimacy. And I just wondered if you would comment on that, Milt, because I'm sure they're a direct result of those three strikes, general strikes, massive strikes in 1934.
Okay, I think we'll take a few questions and then turn the floor over to Milt again. I just wanted to say that I'm so glad that the paper has been doing more labor coverage, and Sue's been adding to that. So that's been great. So that's what she's referring to with on the picket line, is it's a regular column in Workers' World. So Heather.
Well, I have just a question that I'm confused about, which has to do with handing this out, Lenin piece out, and what you were saying in your history. I'm confused about your feeling, or the party's feeling, about the creation of the CIO, and dual unionism. In other words, I'm concerned as to whether or not the creation of the CIO was not, I don't think the AFL would have been moved to do any industrial work at all, and whether or not you think that it was counter-revolutionary for the creation, or infantile communist, for the creation of the CIO, and if that's the case, then what does that mean about the developments that are coming out of Million Work for More?
So what
get-
call the counter revolution?
I'm asking whether or not, I don't understand whether or not you're saying that dual unionism as, I read this while you were talking, but is dual unionism what the CIO did? And is what the CIO did, in your estimation, communism?
Yeah, so we need, what's the difference between industrial unionism and dual unionism? If there's any concern, we need definition. It's not? Okay, then you better repeat it, because that's what I thought you were saying. Okay, I thought that's what it was. Okay, okay. Minnie Bruce.
This is just, I also thought of things in banners. So this is just a detail about the role of women in the sit-down strikes in Flint, and there's a question attached to the comment. So in the sit-downs in Flint, there were women working in the plants. It wasn't just that the women did support as wives and mothers. There were women working in the plants. But when the sit-down happened in Flint, there was a decision that was made, I'm not sure exactly by who, that the women would leave the plants and not stay in with the men. And the rationale behind that was that they were afraid that there would be demonization, sexualization of the fact that the women were there with the men. And so they left. So that the leadership on the outside of the Women's Flying Squad brigades were both women who were sisters or daughters or wives of men who were inside, and also women who were workers, who had been workers in the plant. So it was made up of that, group of women. And they did, just as Milt was saying, that there was this whole organization within the plant during the sit-down to deal with. They published their own newspapers inside the plant. There was a whole structure. Outside, the same thing was happening, coordinated by the women. There was daycare, there were meals, people who were losing their homes, housing was figured out. There was a whole structure in it. And women intervened when there were assaults on the men in the plant. They would go and interpose themselves between the guard, the armed police or whatever, and the plant. And at least in one situation in Babies and Banners, one of the women who was a squad leader, who had been a worker, when it looked like there was going to be an all-out assault on the men who were left inside, and I think this is significant. She stood they had a sound car, so she stood up on top of this truck with the sound car, and she appealed to the people who were watching the confrontation. In other words, there were the people who had come from the town, who weren't all necessarily involved in the strike, who were watching what was happening, but some of them were also people who were not actively involved. And she said, they can't do this if you come over. There's been there too many of us. So this link between the people who are sitting down inside, the women who were then organizing outside, and the solidarity, and trying to bring solidarity with people who weren't already deeply involved in the strike. And it was clear from this documentary that many of the women who were doing this organizing were Sufi. Some of them were still wearing their red berets in the documentary, which was done on the 40th or 50th anniversary of the sit-down. So here's my question. It has to do with coming into the now. The workforce is completely different now in terms of who is working. And now we have the majority of women in this country who are working. There would never be able to be another sit-down where the women were asked to leave the sit-down, because it would be, for some industries, it would be all the workers who would then be out of the plants, right? So when you think about this growing new wave that we're in the middle of with the Million Worker March and so forth, how do you envision women workers in particular strategizing and providing leadership around their role in the workforce. Just some comment around how that might be.
Well, I'm glad Heather raised the whole issue of dual unionism because I was a little confused about it too, because when you were describing the situation in the Soviet Union after Lenin died and how Stalin took over and tried to really further socialist production in the Soviet Union by using, rapid industrialization. But then you said that it was a situation of independent unionism versus dual unionism. I think that's how you put it for the Soviet Union, and describing what was going on in the Soviet Union. But also, I know this is going sort of into the 1940s, but you were saying that leading up to the war, things really changed, not only for the Soviet Union, but for the CPs around the world, including here. And so I was hoping you could talk a little bit about what that shift was. Why is it that the leaders of the communist parties, starting with Stalin, supported this war, World War II, and how that just really impacted on the whole question of unions being independent from the bourgeoisies, especially in imperialist countries. So I was hoping you could, talk a little bit about that. And also, if you can just comment on, the role of black workers, especially in, the sit-down strikes and so forth. What was the condition of black workers at that particular time, especially with all the basic.
Okay, you want to just take a couple more hints and then we're going to go back to Milt. Okay. Cheryl? Or Jen?
What was the catalyst for the organization of strikes? I mean, you see the same conditions today, but there was something that sparked it, something that made that happen. There was, lowering of great wages is something that's happening all over the globe today, but there must have been some sort of catalyst that made the strikes happen, and made people fight back. And I just want to know what that is. Also, with the corporate and banking interests, you see the same thing going on with the wars down running up, and how the imperialist nature of the war, and like the Democrats are saying, well, let's get all countries together to be imperialistic, and the Republicans and the Republican Party say let's be imperialistic ourselves. Let's just go in and get the oil wealth, and Democrats are like, let's combine other countries to go get the oil wealth. So I want to know, what are you saying, what are the similarities that you see today with the war with the corporate wealth and the banking wealth, as well as now the media also promoting?
Archer?
The first question is just about the date. You keep saying Bloody Thursday. What is it, Bloody Thursday? The second is more about the immigrant, the amount, the numbers of immigrant workers undocumented, which is about 46 million. It's 45. I have so I don't know how it was then, but we have a huge workforce now that is skilled in a specific area. It might not be in an industrial union, but they're doing specific work. Most of them are not unionized. How can we apply some of the lessons that we've learned from this decade or that decade that you're talking about, and the second decade, and maybe apply it now to further the struggle and educate these undocumented workers?
All right, Francis, and then we'll...
There were sit-down strikes in many places besides Flint. Actually, the first sit-down strikes occurred in Ohio at an obscure plant called the Ohio Leather Company in a place not far from Youngstown. There were also strikes in the steel industry, and there were especially sit-down strikes in the rubber industry in Akron. It's interesting that between Michigan and Ohio, they really were the place where the CIO really got firm actions, because they were these giant plants which employed thousands and thousands of workers. And there was some craft unions, let's say, in the steel mill, but they were completely ineffective and affected only the, you know, like the crane operators or something like that. Most of the workers were not organized at all. But they did their own forms of sitting in, of strikes, and it took them a long time to get organized to the point where they had contracts, and then even industry-wide contracts. And those stories are also worth, you know, hearing. I remember Ted definitely said that at Republic Steel in Youngstown, he says there were a lot of workers who were from Spain, and they were busy collecting weapons for the Loyalists in Spain. But then their own class struggle broke out, their own war, mini-war broke out, and what the companies did, Republic Steel put the foreman inside the plant, and the workers were on the outside. And he said that from the hills surrounding the plant, the workers took their weapons that they were saving for Spain, and they used them because the company had to get food into the foreman. And the way they did it was they dropped it by parachute from airplanes. So the workers took their guns and shot down the parachutes so that the food wouldn't get in. I mean, you know, it's hard for us to envisage that there was that much you know, violence going on. These were not peaceful struggles. And they took on many, many different forms in different places. Of course, everybody remembers Salt of the Earth, the movie where the injunction was against the miners, and so their wives and daughters went out on the picket line because the injunction didn't cover them, and they held the picket line. That's another movie that should be shown more often than it is from the mine, mill, and smelter workers union. But you know, I'm glad that Milt mentioned You know, were ones I'm sure that Buffalo had its share of militant strikes that went on. I just want to say one thing, because I started to laugh when you said there were no elections in the AFL. My father and my uncle both worked in millinery, but they were in different unions, because the uncle was an operator, sat and sewed, and my father was a blocker, and that was a different local in the millinery union. But I remember my uncle, who was really not militant at all, whereas my father was in the CP. You know, he told me, he said, Francis, the only way the leaders of our union are ever going to get out of office is feet first. In other words, they held office till they died. Alex Rose and all the other labor figures. That's it.
Yeah, have you got, I wasn't writing that. Let me start with, who was the first? Who should I start with?
There was a question that I didn't quite understand myself about, like, the impact of Stalin and the view of the CP.
Okay.
Right? Regarding industrial unions.
That wasn't your question. That was more, that was, yeah. Let me try first with Heather. The result, to just continue for a second, the result of all these struggles led to a committee of industrial unions, the Congress of Industrial Unions. The Committee of Industrial Unions didn't want to leave the AFL. They didn't. The Committee of Industrial Unions wanted, led by John L. Lewis, who actually appointed William Green, who was his lieutenant, to be the head of the AFL himself after Gompers died. The committee itself negotiated how is it possible that the craft members, that those who work alongside the craft union members, who are industrial laborers and other members who worked in the same plants and in the same unions, how could they be incorporated into the AFL with a charter just as similar they have with the craft unions? The AFL rejected that. And as a result of a process that went through very democratic forms, meaning at conventions, history gives one example that sort of highlights the next stage from a Congress, a committee of the industrial unions to a Congress, which is much broader and united of many, many unions. And they cite the Atlantic City Convention of the AFL, where John L. Lewis, who was trying to negotiate for the industrial unions, went up to the leader of the Carpenters Union and smacked him in the jaw and knocked them down, and they all, and the two of them, giants of over 300 pounds, and they rolled around the floor of the Atlantic City. So that example set in motion the decision, the movement toward the split. Okay. So what happened then was the AFL threw out all these unions that had supported the committee. They were members of the committee of the industrial unions, such as Charles Howard from the ITLU, Sidney Hillman from Amalgamated Clothing, Dave Dubinsky from the International Ladies Garment Workers, Thomas McMullen, United Textile Workers, and I'll go on, and even Max Zaritsky from her father's United Hatters, Cap, and Millinery Workers, and then the International Mine and Mill and Smelter Workers. They formed the committee, see. and they were still part of the AFL, but became independent in 1936 when the AFL voted to expel them. So they were expelled from the AFL, and then that began the process so that by 1937, the first CIO conference, and this is mainly to show the growth of the CIO, was incredible. I have figures that go from 2 million to 4 million practically overnight after the sit-downs in the GM. Now that isn't dual unionism. No, it isn't. See, they made it, it was just the way it was described historically. See, the AFL was just intransigent on the basis of merging the industrial union concept with the craft unions. Now, the dual unionism that arose, and it's partly an answer but not completely, there was a CP front group, a mass unit. I shouldn't call it a front group. It's appropriate to have mass units. It was called the Trade Union Unity League. And in the Trade Union Unity League, under William Z. Forster, who was the chairperson of the Communist Party, they were influenced in after 1920, when Lenin wrote this left-wing communism. See, they went along with the idea, and they used the description, you bore from within, you stay within the AFL. They listened to Lenin because that's the way it was in those days. See? But then what happened, when Lenin died and Stalin took over and crushed our left opposition, Stalin began first to eliminate both wings that were opposed. It was an internal fight. See, it was internal, and it wasn't even known in this country what was going on in the Soviet Union. As a matter of fact, a document came out from Leon Trotsky, who was in exile in Alma, and it came through Canada, and they found a document that Trotsky had written, and there was a split. It was a shock all over the country, at least in this country. Now, what happened then was Stalin, after he got rid of the left wing and the right wing, he decided around 1928, for good reasons, to make a shift to the left. He was deeply concerned, as I said in my remarks. Now, how was that interpreted during that period in the Communist Party here? They changed the name of the Trade Union Educational League to the Trade Union Unity League. And they began to take struggles and strikes, and one of the most famous strikes under dual unionism was in Gastonia, North Carolina. And this Communist Party, through the Trade Union Unity League, and because the AFL, who was in that plant, but in the South, in North Carolina in those days, it was bad in the North, but in the South, the repression was incredible. And even though the AFL was what it was in terms of only organizing a few of the craft unions, the Gastonia strike of textile workers and the TUUL of the CP went down there, and they took on the AFL and tried to push them out and take over. the organized struggle of the workers in textile in Gastonia, as well as in Piedmont, Virginia, and Tennessee. And a fight broke out between these contending forces. And the bosses down there, it was a bloodbath in Gastonia. Everybody lost. See, everybody lost. And the company maintained what they had: cheap labor, low pay, oppressed workers, and then imposed their will, drove out Gastonia. Workers were fired, hurt. There was struggles down there. So that the Gastonia, and there were more of them. Even in New York, there was a struggle in the fur workers over the question of dual unionism. So these developments of trying to impose and drive out, after Lenin died, the AFL out of these plants and shops and unions and impose a union, industrial unions, yes, it was progressive, but they were subject as a result of not only the AFL and them battling over the members and who was going to be responsible or have the jurisdiction of the strike, of the industry work. That was a disaster that ultimately Forster gave up. See, by that time, after these strikes and struggles, he decided to go back into the AFL. Why? Is because of the upsurge that began to come about by about 1933. There was, and the unemployment councils that they were leading began to push into the organizing of unions, and there was no CIO. So he went back into the AFL with his unemployment councils and began the process of the upsurge that then developed, in which the CP grew by leaps and bounds, see, until 1938 or 39, and that brings us to Monica's question of what happened by 38 or 39 that led to the Second World War and the Popular Front as opposed to the United Front. See, we will go into that in another class, I think, because that entails a lot more development, so we don't oversimplify the issue of why the CP became a partner with the U.S. in what they called the democratic fight against fascism, and that deserves another. Now, in regard to Minnie Bruce, the way to view everything you said is absolutely correct, including the fact that the women used to get bolts and arms, all kinds of things that were sent out that were inside the plants after the women left. See, and they were an important part of the street battles, as well as providing the food, the clothing, and all these things. And by the way, it wasn't only the CP. Our history was a little involved in that through a woman named Genora Johnson. Genora Johnson, I think. Anyway, but here we are. Now what, you're asking? Well, in my judgment, the technological high-tech revolution now has imposed an entirely different workforce that came out of the technology of the 30s, as I described, the Fords and the assembly lines and the speed-ups and piecework and all those things. Now, as Sam Marcy pointed out in high-tech low pay, the service-oriented workers will probably, in my judgment, and already in many areas, are being led, the struggles, by women. particularly women of color. And there's no problem. There isn't the problem because the unions are on such a defense position now in regard to the attacks on, that those that are merging, I know even in my own union, which was, when I left, was the Teamsters, women are playing a much more important role. As a matter of fact, they're leading a lot of locals in the Teamsters, particularly in the areas of agriculture where food cannery and food services and so on. I think this contemporary period incorporates, based upon the orientation of the technology, that we're going to see a parallel of struggle, but in a different form. In the form of service-oriented workers, not industrialized workers that were primarily male and white in the 34s, except, and this answers something that I want to talk about that Monica raised, the black workers. The black workers who had been, in the earlier days, recruited to break strikes, a new development began that was very interesting. And we need to develop it more and also bring it more up to date. The unemployment councils, as a result of the evictions and the pressure and the brutal attacks on the poor, began to incorporate and recruit black workers into the unemployment councils. And they began to play a particular leading or more of a role of decision and influence in those, and we need to do more research on this. But the unemployment councils that were now inclusive, black, white, immigrants, whoever was suffering under the evictions, the food hunger, and so on, were now amalgamated into the unemployment councils. And then the unemployment councils led, and the CP was progressive on this question. They began to find their way into the labor movement, the early stages of this upsurge that I described in 1934. One other factor that began to develop, and of course, there's a history, we have to bring that up to date, and that is that the CIO had anti-discrimination clauses in the Congress. When the Congress was formed, it wasn't like the AFL-CRAFTS. See, if we study their constitutions, we will see, and it was true, that African-American workers were beginning to enter into the plants. And with the Second World War, I mean, it opened up tremendously. See, and we do have to bring it to the current period, see, with racism and national oppression, see. But during that period, I remember in Buffalo, in the blast furnace brothers, one of our founding members, Vince Copeland, who was in the steel plants. The local, there were 4 locals, and he was in 2603. I was in 2604. It was black workers leading. All Vinny's efforts that culminated in winning grievances and other struggles was done with black leadership. See, the steel plants, although the black workers were concentrated in the heavier part of the industry, in the blast furnace and the open hearts and the coke ovens, nevertheless, they had power. And our job was to find how to unite the rolling mill workers, which were white workers, into a united struggle, particularly around the 1959 strike that we had when I was in steel. But we need to bring that up to date more. We do. It's, you know, the developments change and shift with the objective circumstances and the conditions of the economy and other factors. Finally, on the question of, I said while you were away, that I would like to treat the United Front and the Popular Front, that was what Stalin introduced in 1939, in a different light, because it's not exactly, it follows a different course. But the one thing that was happening was the zigs and zags, see, that took place within the CP party. And naturally, they didn't oppose the Second World War while we did, and our leaders went to jail at that time. One more, was there one more question? 1934 is the Bloody Thursday. It happened, you asked for a date. I'll give you a date. It's 1934, but I don't know the month. I think was May. I'm not sure. I'll look it up. It's in Labor's Untold Story. Now, the immigrant struggle in the 20s followed the line of what happened to the left parties, militant class consciousness under the Palmer raids. The immigrant struggle that developed in the 20s and 30s were mainly immigrants from Eastern Europe. They were mainly Russian, Poland. They came, and many from Ireland came due to poverty, emigrated to the U.S. Many of them were political. The immigrants who came during that period had been influenced by the Russian Revolution, see? And they played a very significant role in this country in the labor movement. Very significant. The Socialist Labor Party, for example, which had many, many workers, but a different orientation than what Lenin had, they practically controlled the Central Labor Council in New York and other big cities. So much so that when the Communist Party was formed in 1919, the majority were immigrants. The American sector, as they call them, that came over from the IWW, the Industrial Workers of the World, and the left wing of the Socialist Party that became the first Communist Party that was formed in 1919, the majority were immigrants, and they controlled the party. It's a lot different than today. See? But they too got the weight of the government. They were just everything that's being done to the Arab community today, see, was done exactly to these immigrants. There was no way the Palmer raids were, and if I could find that chapter where on one day alone, 10,000 I think it's 10,000. I'll find it for you after the meeting to show how much oppression there was against immigrants during that 1920 Palmer raids. Lasted for about 2-3 years to 24, 25. But with the prosperity of that I described, they lightened up a little on that. They needed the workers to create the value, to create the profits. So they lightened up on it, and then everybody came out from underground. See. There was one more question? That's it?
Well, Jet had to leave, but she asked, what is the catalyst for the strikes?
Oh, good,
because workers
Yeah.
often face those conditions.
That's right. I'll give you an example. I think this is an important question because there's no blueprint for it. See, there's no blueprint for this. Give you an example. Frances mentioned Cleveland, Ohio, and she mentions that the sit-downs involved not only Flint, but involved Cleveland. Now in Cleveland, the same conditions that I described that were going on in the speed-ups and the assembly lines and the brutal conditions and the wages were also part of the empire of GM, and they existed in the Cleveland plant, which was what we call the Fisher Body plant. See, they provided this, they had these big presses that would press the bodies and the metal and then shift them to the assembly plants. Well, it was a hot summer day. All these conditions did exist. And then it was one of these days where the temperature was over 100 in the plant, and the workers were just burning them, see. And one worker went over to the master switch, and he just pulled it down. And the plant got quiet. Everything, all the noise of a plant that assembles and shapes metal in the heat, and he just shut it down. And that started to sit down. Now, hey, well, how can you say what's, you know, would that have happened? That's how it happens. See? That's how it happens. And if the conditions are right, and the situation is so combative and angry and hostile to the powers that be, it'll happen. It will. And we can be as best we can. As soon as it happens, we should be prepared as a party to intervene. It's not a spontaneous mass thing yet. It's someone that sparks it. I've seen it in my own experiences in steel when we would be working the night shift, 11 to 7. And they'd be driving us crazy because we had to do better, get better production out than the second shift. We were always put in rivalry to each other as to how much tonnage of steel we had to get out on each shift. Well, this night, it was just impossible. So, all of a sudden, someone yelled from a crane. He pulled it over to the side, and he walked down the steps from the crane, and he said, I've had it, because the heat goes up. Yeah. And I was working in a hot mill. So we all dropped our gloves and walked out with him. I mean, that's how it happens. The next day, the superintendent comes in. He had a good night's sleep, you know, and he comes in. What the hell would you guys do? And you know, he knew I was from New York originally, so he was fingering a couple of us. I said, we don't know. All of a sudden, everybody started walking, so we walked. And that shut the whole shift. That's how it happens. That's it. I mean, I don't know. We can...
Part of it is because I have to go to a meeting, but I think we really want to thank Milt. This has just been such a tremendous lesson, not only about what happened during that period, but the way it's related to today. I think a lot of things that we can learn from. And it sounds like there's going to be another one. The way you said, well, let's wait when we'll deal with World War II later. So there's not going to be a class next week. And of course, the following week, there's, as I said, 14 hours of classes, discussions, plenums, workshops, discussion groups at our National Fight Back Conference. The following week, there's definitely going to be a class because we're going to want to have a really great class to invite everybody we've met at the conference in the New York area to it. So definitely on, I guess it's November 20th. And stay tuned for another class by Milt on, I guess, the next period, which will be the build-up towards World War II. Any announcements? Greg? Yes.
All-day New York City Labor Against the War Conference on November 20th.
Oh, okay.
Okay, so you might not want to have a class like that.
All right, or we won't have it on labor. Okay. And any other